Hi, hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to this book launch, which is a book launch for this book, Estate Regeneration and its Discontents. It's been the author, Dr. Paul Watts, is going to introduce the book. So there'll be an introduction by Paul with some illustrative slides that last about 20 minutes or so. And then we'll be responding to your comments. Please send in your comments and discussing the subjects of the book and what we can do about it. So over to you, Paul. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. Could you put the first slide up, please, Dave? Okay, great. Thanks very much, and thanks very much to Dave and to Bookmarks for putting this on. Really greatly appreciate it, and thanks very much to Paul for chairing this. So yeah, the book is Estate Regeneration, its Discontents. This is a book which I've been doing research on for about 12 years, from 2007 to 2018. And really what it does, what I try and do in the book, is to take people through the policy reasons as to why estate regeneration has taken place, and then really to try and look at what the effects of estate regeneration are on estate residents, the people who live at estates. I should just say that the main focus of the book is about regeneration schemes which involve demolition and rebuild. So it's not really talking about, say, infill or refurbishment schemes. So that's the primary focus, is those schemes which involve then demolition and rebuild. This has been a very, very controversial topic for several years, and obviously, I'm sure a lot of people on the call will know lots about this. So but this is the first book really to provide an overview of this, very, very important topic, basically. Could you put it on the next slide, please, Dave? So the book begins with this quotation from a tenant who was up in Tottenham at a meeting that I attended in the London Borough of Haringey. And really, in many ways, this kind of encapsulates the theme of the book. I'm praying to God, don't regenerate my estate, because regeneration has become a nasty word. And in many ways, that's surprising in some ways, because if you go back to when estate regeneration began in the 70s and the 80s, the 90s, in many ways, estate regeneration was regarded as relatively benign. In many cases, people had seen their homes weren't invested in, the estates weren't properly invested in, and people wanted to see some sort of improvement in relationship to their estates and their homes. What's happened over the last 20 years, the way that estate regeneration has panned out in London, is that it's produced multiple discontents, which is really what the book is talking about. So next slide, please, Dave. So the book, early on in the book, I talk about the Carpenter's estate in Newham, which is in just next to Stratford Station. And the Carpenter's estate has been subject to a long-running regeneration scheme, which began in 2004-2005. And I first went to the estate in 2012. So at that point, the regeneration has supposedly been running then for about 7 or 8 years. And what has happened over the period up until 2012, 2014 is that many of the tenants have been decanted from the estate. And so by the time you get to 2012 or 2013, what happened at that estate is that the estate was then half empty. Now, one of the main rationales as to why estate regenerations are put forward is that it's going to help to, quote unquote, solve the London housing crisis. It's going to provide more homes. Now, what's happened at the Carpenter's estate, but not just the Carpenter's estate, many other estates, is that actually what's happened is that the estate regeneration has resulted in a reduction in the number of social rental homes. And what happened then back in 2014 was that the Focus E15 housing campaign, which was focused around a group of young mothers who were threatened with eviction they were living in a housing association in Newham at the time. And when they applied for housing from Newham Council, rehousing from Newham Council, at this point then, they were told that there's no social housing available. And then they were told, well, if you want us to rehouse you, it might be then outside of the city, or it might be as far away as Manchester or Birmingham or whatever. what happened then is that the women in the campaign, they found out about the Carpenter's estate, which was actually, just an estate which was half empty. At the same time, then, that they're being told that there's no social homes available to them in Newham. So this then prompted a very famous political occupation of the estate. Well, you can see there the banners outside one of the blocks that the Focus 15 campaign occupied for a couple of weeks. And those banners in many ways encapsulate the kind of like the problems with estate regeneration in London. These people need homes, these homes need people. And I think that occupation was really, really important in all kinds of ways, because I think it helped to highlight and symbolize many of the contradictions and quite frankly absurdities that you see in the London housing landscape. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all this in great detail, but the policy background to this is many years of housing disinvestment in relationship to council housing. But also what we've seen is, particularly since 1980, is a very dramatic shrinkage in the size of the sector. If you go back to 1981, roughly one-third of all London households rented from the council. Now it's somewhere in the region of about 12%. So there's been a really major decrease. And a lot of that, there are three main reasons for that. The first is that councils have simply stopped building. And again, what that chart, what it actually shows is that even in the early years of the Thatcher government, there was actually quite a substantial numbers of council homes were still being built. And by the time then that you get to 1993, that's virtually disappeared. But what's really significant about that particular chart is the way that when New Labour then got into government in 1997 up to 2010, there was actually no uptick. There was no increase in the numbers of local authority homes that were built in London. And that's a national phenomenon. And that's very much unlike all previous Labour governments. Essentially, Labour during the 90s and 2000s expected that housing associations would pick up the slack, so to speak, but that simply didn't happen. So councils aren't building anymore. Next slide, please, Dave. And also, I'm sure as everybody's aware, because of the right to buy, there's been a massive depletion in the amount of homes. So by the time you get to 2017, roughly about a third of the London stock had been sold off, 285,000 homes. So again, you have this massive reduction. Next slide, please, Dave. But also, also what's happened though is that estate demolition itself has actually contributed towards the depletion of social rental homes, council homes in the city. So this chart is based on data from the GLA, and it basically shows you then 50 demolished social housing estates from 2004 to 14. And you can see there that the existing homes in 2004, so about 30,000 social rental homes. So the proposal would be then that after regeneration, after demolition, you would have a reprovision of roughly 22,000. So what you've got is a depletion of about 8,000 homes, about 27% of the stock. But what's happened then is in terms of the market homes, that's increased by 1,000% from 3,000 to about 36,000. So what the process of estate regeneration does is it's de facto, it become a process of state-led gentrification. Sorry about that. So what's happened is then estate regeneration has contributed towards the depletion of social rental housing provision in the city. Next slide, please. So what the research consists of then, I was looking at various estates across London, and then I looked, for example, at West Hendon in Barnet. In Haringey, I looked at the Northumberland Park estate. In Hackney, I looked at Woodbury Down and Northwold estate. In Newham, I looked at Carpenter's estate and Canning Town and Custom House. In Tower Hamlets, I looked at the Ocean estate. And in Southwark, I looked at the Aylesbury and the Haygate estate, to some extent the East Dulwich estate. And in Lambeth, then I focused on Clapham Park and on Cressingham Gardens, and also to a lesser extent looked at Westbury and mine's gone, and Central Hill, sorry. Yeah, so if anybody wants to ask any questions about those particular estates, please feel free. Okay, next slide, please. So just to say about London estates is that there's often a kind of sort of very stereotypical views about the design of London estates. And clearly they're actually very, very diverse. So on the left, then you have the smallest estate that I looked at, Crescent Gardens, an estate of 306 homes just next to Brockwell Park. And then on the right-hand side, you have the famous Aylesbury estate, 2,700 homes then. And, this is Aylesbury, I suppose, is the classic brutalist stroke modernist estate. So London estates are incredibly varied. So most of the estates that I was looking at were post-war estates, I should say that. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the issues around that I focus on in the book, and part 2 of the book really, is I'm interested in issues around trying to understand what do people think about living on the estates before the regeneration begins. And essentially, I argue that what's happened is that people, in all kinds of ways, they value the homes that they've got. So the slide on the left is a photograph of West Hendon Estate, and you can see there clearly how people do take great care about the gardens, about the front of their homes. And the slide on the right, that's an interior of a tenant's bathroom in Northumberland Park Estate up in Tottenham. And that particular tenant then he'd spent several £1,000s on doing up the estate in the way that, doing up his home in the way that he actually wanted it to be. So people spent a lot of time and care. And one of the issues around council housing is that, often people kind of stereotype it in the sense that people say, well, council tenants are just renters, so they don't really care about their homes. That's simply not the case at all. Many people, invested a lot of great care and attention in their homes. And so, the tenant there who I called Dave, on the right-hand side was, he was very, very upset at the prospect then that under the HDV scheme that his home and his estate was potentially going to be demolished. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so a couple of slides there on the left, you've got a view of Ocean Estate. On the right, you've got Central Hill Estate. And basically then, again, many ways then people value the estates, particularly long-term residents. They formed relationships there. Many people valued their neighbours. And, again, the sort of stereotype view of estates is that they're sink estates in which, they're kind of these urban hellholes. And simply that's not the case. You can see there the banner at Central Hill. Again, Central Hill is an estate in Lambeth, which is threatened with potential demolition. There's still a campaign about it. And importantly, if anybody's interested, the estate has just been listed. There's an application proposal to list the estate to preserve the estate. And you can see there the banner says, Save Central Hill Community. Next slide, please. One of the problems, though, that people experience on estates is that they do become devalued, and much of that you can put at the blame on the landlords who simply don't maintain and invest enough in the estate. So you've got on the right-hand side again, you've got Northumberland Park Estate, one of the interiors of one of the blocks. So you can see then that clearly this is an estate which is not being properly maintained, and that's certainly one of the main criticisms that people have got in estates. Is that, whilst they inherently value the places and the homes that they live in, nevertheless, they feel that they've been disinvested in and not sufficiently maintained by their landlords. As one tenant said to me, basically the estates need TLC, and that's the problem, is that they're not receiving enough. Next slide, please. Now, when regeneration then begins, what then happens is one of the statutory processes is the process of consultation. And, this is the Haygate estate. I interviewed Olive, who was an ex-tenant. She'd lived at the Aylesbury. She lived at the Haygate for many years. And basically then the quotation, what it illustrates really is the gap which exists between the regeneration professionals' view of what estates are like. Often they regard them as blank spaces of nothing of value. with the way that residents actually then, live at those estates and appreciate those estates. And the quote simply then illustrates the way that the consultant was saying, we're going to give you all these things. And as Olive says, then, well, actually, we've got a lot of these things already. So there's this sort of, mismatch in many ways then between the images that external regeneration professionals have got and estate residents, really. Next slide, please. What happens then is that once regeneration gets underway properly in relationship to the demolition process, then you get put in train what I call the process of degeneration. So rather than regeneration, degeneration kicks in. So for example, then, is the way then that people, as the building works happen, people living on a building site, which is incredibly stressful. Tenants spoke then about the health damaging effects, both mentally and physically on them, having to live with the noise and the dust and the works, etc. And this then goes on for months and months and months. So the photograph on the left-hand side is West Hendon. The photograph on the right-hand side then is the Aylesbury estate in Southwark. And there you can see the way that, despite the fact people are still living in the estate, it's actually been turned into a fortress. Residents were actually struggling to get access to their own homes during the process of the regeneration. Next slide, please. Yeah, so once again, one of the things about the research, and again, I'm sure many people on this call will realise, is that what's happened is that it's part of the general sort of like the resistance to the London housing crisis, so to speak, is that many estates then have formed campaigns to challenge the way that regeneration is being done, and many estate campaigns have been formed. So some of the most famous are Safe Cressingham Gardens and CARP, for example, Carpenters Against Regeneration Plans in the Carpenters Estate. A couple of examples that I've put there is on the left-hand side then is No Permission for Demolition. That's then from the Save Northwold campaign in Hackney. And then on the right-hand side then we have the Stop HDV campaign. And importantly, in relationship to that, because the Northumberland Park estate in Tottenham was actually targeted as part of the HDV. So what happened there was that the Northumberland Park Decides campaign was formed, and they then were one of the key components within the Stop HDV campaign. And in fact, in that particular case, the HDV campaign was stopped. Interestingly, again, on the Save Northwold campaign, again, that was a very, very successful campaign. In the way that they were able to challenge the scale of demolition that was originally proposed. Next slide, please. So then what happens in relationship to, the regeneration promises are that, people are going to get better homes and neighbourhoods. And in many ways, that's not really the way that people experience them. So I've taken these are photographs that I took from a tenant's own photographs of her before and after views that she had. So the view on the left hand then is the view that she had in 2014, looking out from her previous council flat in West Hendon. And then the view on the right hand side is the view then that she currently has then after she'd been moved to a new block. And it simply contrasts then the way that the things that she appreciated about her particular estate then, have been disappeared. They've been ripped away from her, basically. Next slide, please. And also, one of the interesting things about regeneration is the aspects of design. And many London estates, council estates, they were built with external walkways. So what happens then, and you can see that at the left-hand side there, West Hendon, you can see then, what it means is that in order for people to get into their own properties, they have to walk past their neighbours' windows. So, and what happens then is there's a constant sort of sense of interaction. So you can see there, people use the balcony as an extension of their homes. The kids' bikes are out there in the summer. Tenants sit outside the estate, sit outside on the balconies. So it's really part of people's homes, and they're very, very. It's actually in some ways it's quite difficult to be kind of like socially isolated in the state in some kind of ways, partly because of that sort of design. Now The photograph on the right-hand side is one of the new blocks that the tenants were moved into at West Hendon. And as you can see there, what you have is basically an internal windowless corridor. And this is a very, very typical design. So what tenants routinely said to me was that, you know, when they go into their new blocks, they don't feel like home anymore. They actually feel like hotels. And many people described that they were actually living in an anonymous hotel-like existence. It's what the anthropologist Mark Goud calls, these are non-places. They're anonymous places. And particularly then for, you know, elderly and disabled tenants, then, you know, these are places of loneliness and isolation in many ways. Okay, next slide, please. And this is the quote that I end the book in, and this is Annie, the woman who took the photos that I showed then, and she simply describes then the way that you know, she feels more isolated in the new block, and you know, again, that sort of day-to-day interaction that she enjoyed in her previous council block has basically been removed from her. And what she expresses then is very much a sense of bereavement, you know, and particularly she says, you know, she's an older person, and to have that move at, you know, later in life, and particularly to have a forced move like that, is incredibly upsetting. And as she says, you know, mentally she feels isolated, and you know, she's very upset by the whole thing. It is de facto a form of bereavement. Next slide, please. And the claims from the Degeneration professionals is that what you create is balanced and mixed communities. You know, my argument is that that's not what you create. What you actually create is unbalanced and fragmented communities. And there you have Woodbury Down. You have one of the entrance, the concierge entrance to one of the new blocks. And then just across the road is the other side of the Seven Sisters Road. Is there you've got some of the old blocks which are still standing, and people are still council tenants are still living there. So you know, these are not, you know, balanced communities in any kind of way, shape, or form. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much.
Okay, Paul. Thanks. That was really useful. I'd just like to perhaps kick off the discussion. Firstly, I should have said, my name's Paul Burnham. I'm the Secretary of Haringey Defend Council Housing, and I'm also involved in the Homes for All campaign. We've had a number of struggles around demolition and redevelopment, which Paul's already referred to there. And the first thing I'd like to say is I think that it's really important that books like this written, that they're published, and that people actually buy them and read them, because the whole discourse around estate demolition is very much up for grabs, because there's a whole idea, all the stigmatization that Paul's referred to is incredibly strong on the one hand. On the other hand, there's many people who reject all those ideas, who realise that these are the developers coming in. This is profit before people. We understand all that, and then in the middle, to be honest, there's loads of people who believe both ideas. I think probably 5% believe all the stereotypes, 5% reject all the stereotypes, and 90% of the people have both ideas at the same time. And many of those people who have both ideas at the same time are the politicians, the councillors, who actually are the people who make decisions. So I think it's really important. We don't just buy the book and read it ourselves. We actually get our councillors and members of parliament, if they got time, to read the book, to talk to Paul about it, and to discuss the concepts that are being put forward. So I think it's incredibly important. And when I read the book, and to be honest, I've been friends with Paul for a long time. In the last 12 years, when he researched the book, I heard bits of it. In fact, I've heard bits of it several times. We've gone through the argument many times about exactly what happened at Clapham Park, exactly what happened at the Carpenters, the first meeting at the Carpenters, and all this kind of stuff. And there's really some new concepts in the book which are really useful. So it's really one of them is neo-housemanism. So what on earth does that mean? Well, what it means is that the redevelopment of the estates is like what happened in France in the mid-19th century when the French government got an urbanist, an architect, an urbanist and planner called Baron Haussmann to redesign Paris, because there'd been a revolution, because they're getting a lot of trouble from the growing working class. And so Haussmann said, what we'll do is we'll knock it all down. All the areas that riot, all the areas they put up barricades, we'll knock it down. We'll make streets that are so wide that they can't put up barricades and that are wide enough for us to get the army down there to sort them out where necessary. And that's what they did. And Haussmann said that because it was an expensive plan, usual stuff, because it was an expensive plan, he went to the government and said, look, it's for reasons of national defense, so you've got to give us the money. And that's what they did. So in other words, what's behind it is fear of the working class, is fear of council housing. Council housing represents the 1945 post-war settlement. It represents the days when workers were strong. Workers had fought in the First World War, they've fought in the Second World War, and they said, don't let us down this time you've got to build those houses. And that's what governments of both parties did. And now they're trying to row back from that situation. So it's really important that we understand the history of it as well. And I just, something else which I really liked in the book, which is really important, was talking about a difficult thing to talk about, which is social murder. In other words, the fact that this makes people, this process that goes on for years, goes on for decades, makes people ill, and it kills people off. So Paul talks about the thing which tenants and house owners have on estates, which is ontological security. Again, what does that mean? It's a sociological concept. What it means is our home's our own. We've got nothing to worry about. We've got our own keys. If we pay the rent on time, we can do anything we like, have any opinions we want. We can criticize the council if we want. They can't do anything about it. It's a fantastic feeling, I'm telling you, because most of us have been private tenants in the past. You couldn't do that. When I was a private tenant, if you think I could criticize my landlord, I couldn't do it for one simple reason. The landlord can simply say, cheerio, I don't want you anymore, goodbye, and cause a lot of problems. Essentially, we have a security until they bring in this thing of challenging us by saying we want to knock it down. And I had a very clear example of that a couple of years ago. It happened in a borough somewhere in London, and it involved a tenant who was a late middle-aged tenant. He was described as a happy-go-lucky guy, and he used to cook his dinner with the windows open, and he would chat to his neighbours and say, I've got some food on the go, do you want some, etc. And they'd laughed and joked about it. Until one day, unfortunately, when the council said, we want to knock your homes down, and it didn't bother with any consultation. They just said, we'd like to move somewhere else. We'd like to show you these flats. They took the tenants to show them these alternative flats, which had a different landlord, which is a housing association. The rent was £100 a week more, and they were 1 beds instead of 3 beds, and you weren't allowed to put anything on the wall. That's what they told the tenants. And this happy-go-lucky individual went home, went back into his house, and essentially was never really heard of again, and passed away. So that's the price of them messing us around with these policies. I don't call them regeneration, by the way. I refuse to use the term because I think that that's not what this is about. This is about something much more serious. And I just perhaps finish by asking you a question, Paul, because I think you've done a lot of writing on these general topics over a long time, and I know you've written a lot of articles about different aspects of housing, the way it impacts on working class people, the way it impacts on some of the objectives that housing policy used to have in the past, and you've used these terms, state-led gentrification, which I think is really important, because there's always been gentrification. If there's a market, you always get areas like Hackney that for some reason become fashionable and suddenly become more expensive to live there. And you have other areas where relatively become less fashionable and they've become proletarianized. But this is something different, because the state is actually saying, what they're doing in, where we live, North Tottenham. They're really being targeted. The state's saying we want to increase house prices in North Tottenham. We want to increase market rents in North Tottenham. We want to increase retail prices in North Tottenham, so it costs you more money to get a bite to eat or get a haircut, etc. You won't be able to do it the way you've done it in the past. That's quite different to what's happened before. The other thing that you used, which I think was really important, is social cleansing. So this is a form of forcing people out of the areas where they've lived in. So isn't it really important the way we contest these ideologies, and isn't it really important as well as writing books? I don't know how many tens of thousands of words your book is. It's very, very valuable and people should read it. We also need to have the 5 words, state-led gentrification and social cleansing. Maybe it's 6 words. We really have to have a motto there which people understand that's what is being said. So what do you think?
Yes, clear language is very, very important, and one of the issues around the way that regeneration is essentially sold is that it's a sanitized kind of process. And one of the points I make in the book is the way that some of the consultations, you can't even actually find the word demolition, which is kind of quite shocking, really. So what happens is that the real costs of what's going on in the process are never really properly explained in many ways. Yeah, and again, whatever term you want to use, state-led gentrification or social cleansing, it's important to realize the kind of like the real changes that are going on. And yes, and clearly what happens then is you get a reduction in social housing, but also then this is the point about the process. What it does is it quote unquote unlocks land values, and that then increases house prices and private rents. So people living in the neighborhood, and a recent study was just done on this, which showed then that house prices in 10 London areas, which have been so-called regenerated, had actually increased. Well, that simply then makes it more unaffordable for working class people to live in those areas. So, so regeneration is not doing what it's saying it's doing on the tin, basically. Should we take some questions from other people? There's a question from Pete. What we're finding is that while there's neglect by the Council of Estates, the housing association developers who build new blocks are no better and often worse. Absolutely. One of the real, criticisms that people make about the new properties that they move into is that these are tinny, insubstantial, not properly built. The walls are thin. They've not been properly finished off. And despite the kind of criticism that people have about the councils often didn't properly invest and maintain the stock. Nevertheless, the actual buildings were regarded as solid buildings. That was a routine issue that people brought up. These are solid buildings. And certainly you can't say that about the new replacement housing association blocks. These are, they do feel, and tenants said that, it's a classic. And one woman in the estate, she said she could hear her next door neighbour having sex. And this is just, you couldn't hear that in a previous council block, basically. So, yeah, and Julian's entirely right. Yeah, in that, is that sometimes people, the issues are what happens with estate regeneration, because under the old stock transfer, at least you have to have a ballot, and you have to have the case that. Tenants' rights are put very clearly. The problem is that many of the regeneration schemes is that what de facto it is, it's a backdoor stock transfer, but people have not actually voted for it, and they get then a housing association who, in many ways, then not necessarily their rights are not necessarily as good as they were before, or there's a time limit to those particular rights. For example, in terms of rent increases.
Okay, thanks. That's really great. And then there's a couple of other comments there. So Pete Furman is also commenting about the balanced communities and the mixed communities. as the objective. And of course, the impact of the right to buy over 40 years of it is that we have mixed tenure communities. It's very common that housing associations have bought up right to buy properties on council estates and they've become housing association tenancies. It's very clear that in many cases people have exercised the right to buy, and the people that were tenants are now homeowners on those estates. It's very clear also that many of people who've exercised the right to buy and sold it on to somebody else, and so you have new homeowners coming onto estates as well. It's also very clear that many of those right to buy properties have become private rented properties these days. So we have private tenants on estates. And it's also very clear that the majority of people on council estates are still secure tenants of the local authority. So we've got mixed tenure. And when they knock it down and when they rebuild it, what we're getting, especially now, is really firm insistence on tenure segregation. So now, after rebuild, if they rehouse the council tenants, they're in one block or in one door, and if they rehouse the resident leaseholders, they're in another block, or they're in a separate door in the same block, and it's just wrong. And this, of course, amazingly in London. This goes through under an amazing policy known as inclusion, and officers seriously argue with a straight face that separate entrances for separate tenures is the highest form of exclusion. It really is, bullshit to the power of whatever you want. And really, we have to carry on about that and campaign against it, because people don't want this. It isn't right, and people don't want it. And it is a question of really organising to throw those arguments back, I think. Do you want to take some more, Paul?
Yeah, sure. So again, I think Julian was talking about, mixed tenure is used as a Trojan horse. Council estates are criticised as monoculture. Yeah, I mean, this is a typical kind of like comment that the states are monoculture. This is absolutely ridiculous. If you look at estates, London estates, these are the most diverse places in the entire city. Certainly in terms of ethnic diversity. So the idea that they're monoculture is simply ridiculous, really. And, again, that's, I was at a meeting a few years ago whereby this is the way that estates were described: monoculture, monotenure. That's simply not the case. And as Julian rightly says, since the right to buy, estates, there's homeowners and council tenants. And also, as Paul said before, because many ex-right to buy properties have been sold off, so you have private tenants. So the notion of monotenure, monoculture is simply, it doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense. Yes, somebody's asked about what's the reason not to look at infill developments. That wasn't a kind of a, I didn't kind of, the journal, this is ethnographic research. I did it over many, many years, and I didn't sort of, sit down and think I'm going to look at certain estates. Many ways that, I was guided by the people I met through the process of attending meetings, and then I would follow up and go to estates, again, and I met a lot of people, and some people were incredibly welcoming to me, and I went to those estates, and it tended to be the estates that I was looking at were the estates that, were involved demolition and rebuild, basically. I mean, I think there are particular issues around infill, I think that, whereas I would say that demolition is pretty much always wrong, I think infill is, possibly there's more of a debate around that, but nevertheless, I can clearly see that there are real issues around, people on estates then losing their green space, losing space at the value. And of course, there's the socio-spatial justice arguments is, well, why should all the infilling take place in working class parts of the city? Why isn't there infilling in, say, Hampstead or Highgate? And certainly there's a good argument for that, really.
Do you want me to carry on?
Yes. Shall I just look at some more questions? Yeah, somebody's asked about SPVs doing a better job than councils. Yeah, I mean, I'm just for my sins. This is from Sarah. I'm just a member of the Labour campaign for council housing, and I've just been doing some work on SPVs with Martin Wicks from the campaign. And I think our argument would be that SPVs are really not a great vehicle in many kind of ways. There are all kinds of reasons for that. One of the reasons is simply around transparency. One of the whole points about council housing is that, they're part of the public realm. You can get information on them. You can submit FOIs. And what happens then with SPVs, and this is clearly the case in some London SPVs, is that when residents try to find out information about, say, for example, what is the level of social housing in local housing companies, they can't find that information because it's deemed to be outside the public parameters, basically. So what you're creating is these quasi-private, quasi-commercial entities, which then are simply democratically not accountable. And so our general argument would be that SPVs are not a great thing. Really, the only solution ultimately to the housing crisis is one, end the right to buy. Two is build a new generation of social housing, much preferably council housing.
Okay, thanks. Just like to see that Southwark Defend Council Housing says no permission without demolition, but councils blackmail temporary tenants in ballots. Vote no and you won't get a secure tenancy. How can we win ballots? I think on that, it's very clear that we have to get secure tenancies for temporary tenants, whichever way they vote in the ballots. Because what we're seeing is the principle of ballots being conceded, and then it's being clawed back. And we know that when Jeremy Corbyn made his speech at the Labour Party conference in 2017 and said that there had to be ballots and we're not going to put up with forced gentrification and social cleansing, he had an immediate backlash from Labour councils, obviously, who said that they didn't want ballots. And what then happens is that we have ballots in some cases. Sometimes you don't get ballots. Sometimes ballots are promised and they don't take place. But when ballots do take place, we find that there are a large number of temporary tenants who are effectively voting to have a secure tenancy. Nobody's going to vote against the secure tenancy if they haven't got one, obviously. And so it's not fair. It's buying votes. It's ballot rigging. It's not really a vote about the proposals. It's a vote about something else. So we have to force the issue, really, so that those temporary tenants do actually get the secure tenancies up front. And the other thing that we have to do is to campaign to make sure that everybody understands the issues and start as early as possible in that campaigning. That'll be a second suggestion of mine. And the third suggestion is that when we have a no vote, we ensure that that is respected. Now, up to now, there's been one no vote that's taken place in London. It's at Gilbers Yard and Juniper Crescent in Camden, which is a housing association estate. And what we've seen there is the landlord come back and want to reballot almost immediately. And they've, even worse than that, they've held one-to-one meetings with tenants to find out why they voted no, and something that's really unacceptable, because there's a disparity of power, a disparity of influence between the landlord and tenant here, what makes that completely unacceptable. Now, it just so happens that that's taken place in Keir Starmer's constituency, and Keir Starmer ought to be speaking out over that, ought to be standing up to say that where the ballots take place and people decide to overturn their landlord's recommendation, that should be recommended. I think we all ought to get behind that campaign. We ought to spread the news about it and support it so that that decision is accepted. And, if that is the case, then that gives more people confidence to vote no as well in future. Do you want to go back to you, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, William Ackos asked, is there scope to reverse these trends? Does having a mayor with a London plan change the dynamic, or is it inevitable? Well, ultimately, nothing's inevitable. I think there's clearly there's massive forces, pushing for these kind of schemes, but nevertheless, there's massive pushback as well. And I think that one of the issues that's taken place is precisely around the way that the various campaigning that's taken place. It has had the effect of changing the notion of regeneration from an automatic good thing, which one should automatically get behind, to actually changing it towards an issue which is deeply problematic, and that a lot of that is down to the work of housing campaigners who have basically publicised these issues and said, look, this isn't the kind of developments that we want. Interestingly, around some people I'm sure on the call will know this, but when Sadiq Khan was originally elected back in 2016, there's lots of issues around ballots, and certainly at one point in time, Sadiq Khan and the main housing people, they didn't want ballots. That was actually something that housing campaigners fought for. Paul, myself, and various other people I'm sure on the call. And then eventually they accepted the idea of ballots. As Paul's explained, though, however, the principle of ballots, I think, is a very positive thing. However, the problem is the way that they're being done, and in some cases, as Paul was talking in the Camden case, being pressurised to redo them, is clearly against the democratic principles, really. So, there are certainly issues, but everything's to play for. All of this is ultimately it's down to politics and the various pressures that people can put on the politicians, really, which is incredibly still. It's in that sense. I do believe that everything's up for grabs, basically, and the London housing crisis is not going away. Despite, clearly COVID's changed the landscape in many, many kind of ways, but nevertheless, many of the kind of issues still seem to be there. And some of the states in the book, they're still, as I said, Central Hill is still very much alive. It's still very much a live campaign, and Cressingham Gardens as well, to combat and contest what's going on.
Okay, thanks. So I'd like to just give a scoreboard.
Can I just ask some of the questions? Is that all right?
Please do.
Shall I ask some of the? So Leslie's asked, do the changes have to come from each council, or is it the national policy behind everything? I think that's a very interesting question, and it's something that I've kind of struggled with over the years. And clearly, the national policy from central government sets much of the policy framework, and councils have got to operate within that framework legally. However, having said that, it does seem to be the case, and certainly I think you can see that in London, is that some councils, have got a more progressive in relationship to this than others. And, I've not studied it in depth, but certainly, and I live in Islington as well, but certainly my perception is that Islington, whilst I appreciate there are certainly issues around Islington, I'm not saying it's perfect, but nevertheless, it does seem to be, seem to be more progressive than some other Labour councils, which have been much more happy and to demolish estates, really. So I think that there is, I think one of the issues in London is obviously many London councils are Labour councils, and there is a tendency sometimes, I think, for them to say, oh well, there's nothing we can do because it's the big bad Tory government or coalition government, so it's got no capacity to do anything. I don't think that's true either. There is a capacity to do something, but clearly it's within these very awful national policy frameworks, really.
Okay.
Sarah's asked about the frame of demolition and regeneration as new homes built is interesting. Can you talk? Yeah. I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, one of the issues is, and this is where it does become incredibly difficult in many ways, is is the kind of like, is the language gets incredibly technical about what does affordable housing mean, what does affordable rent mean, what does London living rent mean. So what you have is a series of technical housing terms, but also the way that these terms are then spun, particularly then by councils, by housing associations, by developers. So you get a spinning around these. So these are quite difficult technical terms, but then they're spun in all kinds of ways to make it out then that certain social homes are being provided, or affordable homes. But in reality, then, they're not properly social homes, they're not properly affordable homes. And, that is one of the important things that I think that housing campaigners have done. I mean, clearly has been the excellent work of the 35% campaign in Southwark, who have really done a fantastic job in unearthing the detail of the way then that the council sort of spin and say, well, we're providing all these new great affordable homes, but actually once you drill down into what's actually being provided, is that it's not doing what it says it's doing on the tin. And that's something that housing campaigners have been doing and highlighting, and Paul himself has done lots of work around that, around for example around rent levels. So when councils say, well, we're providing you these council homes, okay, well, what are the rent levels? What kind of rent levels are there? And that's the kind of really important detailed analysis that people are doing, and holding councils and housing associations to account. Just try to look at some of the questions.
Okay.
Issues of the rehousing process, that is, I mean, there's very, very complicated issues. Again, there are issues in relationship to, lots of issues around different tenures. And already talked about temporary tenants, and certainly amongst the estates that I looked at, temporary tenants generally had very, very, the rehousing process was a very coercive process. Many people went to court, and so it's a kind of, they're actually sort of they were actually criminalized in some kind of ways, and that was, that was very, very disruptive, very, very disturbing for some of the people who had to go through it. Secure council tenants generally, they have sort of better rights, but having said that, again, talk about it in the book, is that certainly some people then felt that that the process itself was not fair to them, that they weren't being properly listened to when they got in the interviews with the housing officers, that their concerns about where they were going to be rehoused weren't taken seriously. So there's all kind of, and running through that is, so rehousing. And Paul was just mentioning about the interviews in the individual one-on-one interviews. It's a power relationship. It's a relationship of power, and between the landlord and between the tenant in relationship to rehousing. And one of the interesting things in the book is that I say, some of the people that I interviewed, I should say, some of the tenants that I interviewed, that they didn't want their interviews put in. And I didn't put them in because they're very critical about the council, about the rehousing process. But essentially, they were afraid. They were afraid of some sort of punitive response against them by the council. And again, so that reflects the way that councils are in a sort of monopolistic position. It gives them a great deal of power, so that's a very, very important part of the process, really.
Yeah, can I just say something I really liked about the book? I really liked the way that you brought out the length of time that these processes take. Now, I noticed from talking to councillors who are tempted to go in for these kind of schemes that they really think it's going to be quite simple and quite quick. So you take these houses that you've got, you take them off of the table, you move the land around, and you build different ones. And if it looks like a good deal, you go for it. Almost as if you're just rearranging the pieces without any without any time lag. And the reality is that it can take so long. I was really struck by the Woodbury Down that you've told me about many times. The fact that when it was first proposed over 20 years ago, one of the arguments for knocking it down was that some of the housing was in the worst condition, and that once they got agreement to do the redevelopment, they decided not to knock those blocks down for a while. They decided to knock some other blocks down next to the reservoir and build a load of private housing, etc. And not only that, but 20 years on, those worst blocks are still there. They're still there, and you think they've had much TLC because they've been listed for demolition for 20 years. What does that do to the service that actually gets delivered? How high a priority is a block that's listed for demolition on the manager's list? Not very high. This really needs to be understood, I think.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about that is, and I do talk about it in the book, is about the Decent Homes programme, and that's often feted as being, Labour politicians often say that's one of the great successes. Well, actually, what you had is a kind of an interaction between decent homes and estate regeneration. So what happens then is that those estates then which were put under regeneration, slated for demolition, like Woodbury Down, like West Hendon, then they get taken out of the Decent Homes programme. So ironically then, estates then which are under so-called regeneration, their conditions actually deteriorate relative to their next door neighbours, which got the Decent Homes works. And certainly that happened at Woodbury Down. And also at parts of Clapham Park, is that the estates didn't get, it was many years before they actually got the new windows and kitchens, etc. So it's actually, again, that's sort of part and parcel of the kind of the degenerative aspects of so-called state regeneration. Let's try and look at some questions. Yeah, Julian said about leaseholders and freeholders and estates also oppose demolition. Yes, absolutely. Yes, that's clearly, and that's been a very, many estates. It's certainly the case then that what you have then is you have, in terms of the campaigns, you often have coalitions. So you have coalitions then of tenants and leaseholders or freeholders who then basically then come together to campaign to save their homes and save the communities. And in a way, because in some ways, again, because of the position of secure council tenants, leaseholders in some cases can actually form really important parts then of the campaigns against demolition, basically.
Would you like to respond to Pete Furman's question? Anybody else had issues with the considerate constructors scheme, Paul?
Well, again, Pete will know this. Is that there are supposedly supposed to be set hours of work for the building work, for the demolition and building works to be going on. I think it's typically 8 till 6 and then 9 till 1 on the weekends. But what tenants routinely were told me, and I heard it myself, is that the work would begin before 8 and it would go on beyond 6. So residents are constantly in this position of having to, challenge the contractors as saying, yes, yet again, you're going beyond the hours of work. And it's a constant process. And again, it's this issue that, so tenants have got to prove that they've got to prove that this is going on. So it's an incredibly wearing process at the same time that people are physically, have got this noise, the banging, they've got the dust, and there's one of the interviews in the bus in the several people said in the book, it's literally a process that drives people mad. And people become unhome through the process. They can't actually stay in their homes during the day because of the noise and the dust. So, it's a process. Again, this is supposedly a process which is supposed to be improving people's lives. It's actually making their homes, their lives worse. Again, again, I think that underpins the kind of some of the class issues. It's the way that working class people on estates are not taken seriously. This would not happen in Hampstead. None of this stuff would happen in Hampstead. The contractors would not, they wouldn't even contemplate trying to get away with it, because they know that basically the professionals, the upper middle class in Hampstead and Highgate, etc., would be on their backs like that, and the councillors would be on their backs again like that. So there's a class dimension to all of these kind of issues that run throughout the book. Working class people, living in working class areas of the city, they're simply not, that their views aren't taken seriously. So it's a kind of, in Bourdieu's sociological terms, it's a form of symbolic violence, that's enacted against, people living on estates, which, as I said, and one example of that was given in the book, is the way that is about stigmatization, is the way then that, estates become stigmatized, and TV companies, they go to estates, particularly regeneration estates, and they treat these as kind of as these film sets for their dystopian fantasies. At one estate, Carpenter's estate, TVs were thrown out the top floors of the window, and the residents were told to get back inside. That wouldn't, again, this would not happen in Hampstead or Highgate. It just wouldn't be contemplated. So there's a class disrespect built into many of these processes. Yes, Emily's there from Northwold. The process even without was utterly exhausting. Exactly. Yes, and that's certainly correct. Is that the Save Northwold campaign, relatively, 18 months was a very long and exhausting time. However, it was actually, relatively short term. It's quite astonishing that the people are still campaigning on the Aylesbury estate. Over 20 years after the stock transfer ballot was put in place, and there was a campaign was formed called What, which was basically worried against a tenant's transfer. And some of the people involved in that campaign 20 years ago, they're still campaigning. This is sucking the life out of people. This is really not. This is not a fair process, not a just process in any kind of way. Why would somebody have to expect to be sitting in meetings about regeneration for 5, 10, 15, 20 years? I mean, it's a form of mental torture that's going on, and it's quite, and it literally sucks the life out of people. People get, as I say, it's a kind of like it's a waiting for Godot process, and Godot never arrives, and people are stuck in this awful limbo land for years and years and years. And again, the class basis of that's simply, the people who live up in Hampstead and Highgate, they wouldn't put up with this. Why should working class people have to put up with this?
Fantastic. That's great stuff.
Yeah, Pete's just talked about the contractors and about the issues of workers. Yeah, and I'm sure that's a real issue, is about, the way then that these schemes are done and financed, and how then that the workers themselves then, are exploited as part of it, really. Somebody said about no amenities. I think certainly, London, but one of the interesting things about London estates is that, these aren't peripheral estates. London estates are, they're not like the estates in Chicago, which were if you look at the so-called projects in Chicago, like the Robert Taylor homes, those areas of Chicago were cordoned off by major expressways. Those were isolated areas. Or if you look at the Parisian banlieues, those are pushed out to the extremities of the city. That's not London estates at all. London estates are part of the inherent fabric of the city. They're not over there. They are here. They are the city. And that's one of the things that I don't think that, politicians sufficiently realise, is that one of the things that makes particularly inner London such a great place to live is precisely the high proportion of council housing that was built by the London County Council, by the GLC, by councils like Southwark in the first 80 years of the 20th century. That was, in many ways, and that's one of the points I talk about in the book, this is a political project. Labour councils built council homes, and they built them right in the heart of the city, and that's made inner London, historically an affordable place for working class people. Very, very different situation, social geography, from the situation in, as I said, in the US cities, in Chicago, or in the Parisian suburbs, basically where the social housing estates are pushed out to the edge. So what you have in Paris is a bourgeois centre and a working class periphery based around social housing in the periphery. In London, at least until the first 80 years of the 20th century, what you had is an inner city, working class city in the centre. And the provision of council housing was absolutely key to the way that enabled workers then to live and work in the city. If that makes sense. Do I think it would be different if the council and developers had to live on the estates? From Jack. Well, they might have hopefully they might have more of an insight. And certainly, to be fair, some councillors do live on estates. But increasingly what you tend to find is that there's a kind of what social scientists, geographers call, there's an othering process. In other words, then, that people from the outside, they view these places as these strange kind of urban realms with actually very little real understanding of what's going on. But certainly, I have to say that I interviewed some councillors who were, for example, in West Hendon, some of at the time, there were Labour councillors who were very, very, very much involved in actually challenging what was going on those estates. Yeah, I mean, I've heard about the recent stuff in Southwark around that sort of. Yeah, I mean, that's entirely that's really unacceptable that should be going on. I mean, that's just that's not what should be happening. It should be, democratic councils should be democratically accountable to their electors and shouldn't be trying to, in any way, shape or form hoodwink them, basically. Yeah, the interesting thing about, Anne Cooper asked about, done a study on the increase in mental health problems and mental distress. I mean, that I'm not aware of any specific study that's specifically targeted that. But certainly it's a theme that runs throughout the book. And, estates, for all kinds of reasons, do have, vulnerable people living on them. And, and then what happens is that this kind of, demolition behemoth comes onto the estate, and clearly then it can exacerbate people's pre-existing any kind of mental health issues that people might be having. So, and one of the points that I make in the book is that those health costs, the mental health costs, the physical health costs, who's bearing those costs? Well, it's the NHS that's bearing those costs. All of those additional negative health costs that result from estate regeneration involving demolition, they're not borne by the developers or the councils. They don't appear on their balance sheets. There's no cost. But of course, there is a cost, because people, and I interviewed a GP who told me that her GP practice was full of people from the next door estate who were basically incredibly worried about what the regeneration would mean to them. So it's the NHS, the universalist part of the welfare state, is actually paying for the recommodification of housing, which estate demolition entails.
Paul, I think that's a really important point, but I do think it's something that is under-researched. What we always see when demolition is proposed is a balance sheet which says that people's health is going to be improved. It's going to be a much more healthy environment, and and it's not properly tested out. So one way which we found to test it out was that landlords do actually hold statistics on the number of tenancies ended by death. So we asked a freedom of information request about Love Lane. It's an estate that council's been trying to knock down since 2012. One of these really long-running situations where nothing ever happens for many, many years. And the answer came back that effectively indicated that probably there was a higher level of tenancies being ended by death on that estate. But that's not part of they've never taken any responsibility for that. We've not been able to push that onto the agenda. And I think that there's so many things like that where we can really build up the evidence base and really insist that this is taken into account before you start on the program, before you even think about it. Don't just say you can just switch everything round without any cost. No, there will be a cost. You have to quantify that cost and take it into account. Not just in cost terms, but in human terms as well. Is it really a good idea to do that to people?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's one of the points that I make in the book is the way that if I've read a lot of reports from the regeneration industry, from architects, from all kind of consultants. And the way that these reports are written is that regeneration is a win-win. There are no losers. There's no costs. Everybody gets prizes. And that's simply not the case. And that's, there are all kinds of massive disbenefits. And again, because of this, the process goes on for years after years after years. It has all kind of very, very negative impacts on residents. And these things are not factored in. They don't appear. I've read lots of these reports. It's very difficult to find any comments in those reports which say, do you know what? This process was actually quite difficult for people. This was a very difficult process. Psychologically, socially. You don't sit, and that's one of the points. This is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, to be frank, is I wanted to tell the truth as far as it's actually, from the resident's point of view. This isn't a cost-free process. This is a very destructive process in many kind of ways, and it's actually, it's intellectually dishonest to pretend that there are no costs. There are massive costs to this. And those things are not flagged up by the regeneration industry. They're simply not.
Great stuff. I think that's really the message we have to get out there.
Julian's asked about, is there any argument simply with councils wanting to demolish to increase the number of homes and lack of money for building, possibly, the thing is, you might have a certain amount of sympathy, but you have to also say, if that's the best you can do, that the only way you can increase the social housing supply, or the housing supply, by knocking down the homes of poor and vulnerable people, that to me just sounds that's not really credible. It's simply that's not a credible policy, and you really need to think again seriously about what you're doing if that's the way that you're acting. Pete Furman's asked, have any comments from architects, planners and regeneration experts on the book? I gave a talk a few years ago to an architectural practice, I won't name what it is, and based on the research from the book. And, there's kind of it was interesting because there was some, I could sense that some people were kind of recognizing some of the things that I was saying, but there was also quite a bit of, criticism, saying, well, this is all just anecdotal evidence. And at that point, I think I'd done something like 100 interviews. So I thought, right, well, I'm going to do. I obviously haven't done enough interviews. So that's when I went to a few more estates and did another 80 interviews. Basically, I thought, I'm not having that sort of, anecdotal criticism. This is, I'll stand by this work. This is a serious piece of academic research. I did it, and I did undertook a survey in Northwold, and many of the kind of like the qualitative findings that I draw upon were reflected in the quantitative findings from the Northwold study. People don't get enough information about what's really going on. The consultations are not really proper. They're not fit for purpose, and most people don't in London. They don't want a scorched earth demolition approach to their estates. What they want is they want the estates improved. They want the existing estates improved. They want the repair service to improve. They want the maintenance to be improved. They want the landlords to stop neglecting those estates. But that's not to say that they want to have the whole thing knocked down and started again. Obviously some people are living in very poor circumstances. Some people are overcrowded in particular. Those people, because they're living in such terrible circumstances, one of the points I make in the book is that some people can, opt for, say, look, I'm in such desperate circumstances that I do want demolition. But generally, I would say that those people tend to be a minority.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary argument, isn't it, in policy terms, as an argument for demolishing the estate. The fact that some people are overcrowded and that the landlord refuses to rehouse them into appropriate accommodation. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, who is the landlord who's refusing to rehouse them? It's the same landlord whose only answer is to want to knock the estate down. I mean, it's understandable why individuals take that view, but in policy terms, as an argument for knocking estates down, it's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, and of course, the reason why is there so much overcrowding? Well, again, this is down to national policy. The simpler the fact is that the massive shrinkage of social housing provision in this city, that's why people are overcrowded. People are overcrowded in social housing, can't transfer to more suitable properties, and people in private renting, many people are overcrowded in those. They would like to get out of that again, but there's not enough social housing provision. And I examined a excellent PhD 2 or 3 years ago, which was the title of it was called by a chap called Donald Orr. It's called "Own the Overcrowded," because what's happened is that being overcrowded is not enough of a reason anymore for people to be transferred. But that's down to the shortage of social housing, particularly council housing. So again, the idea that Paul is entirely right. This is a macro policy that needs solving. But you're not going to solve that by knocking down estates basically. David Martin's asked, what do you see for the future working class in London? That's a big question, David. I think, again, as I said earlier on, I think that, there's things are up for grabs, basically. The social, it's clear there are massive social forces, pushing policy in a certain way. But we can clearly see that there's always a kind of like a pushback from below about the kind of people's living circumstances. So I'm reasonably optimistic that that there is a future clearly for working class people in this city. There has to be, because this is a great city. But the thing that makes it great is precisely the fact is that it has such it's not a bourgeois place, particularly in London, and it's a very mixed place. But it's mixed because of the the existence of public housing, council housing, social housing. That has provided a real space in which working class Londoners can live, and it must be preserved.
Okay, Paul. I think we've had a lot of discussion there. I've had lots of comments and questions. Thanks to everybody
Thanks very much.
That's commented. You've really helped to make the show. Shall we move on just to some final remarks there? Do you want to make some final remarks?
No, well, just to say thanks very much. Sorry that we've not been able to, address all of the comments and there's a lot of comments there, questions, not being able to address all of those. Please feel free to email me, and I'm very willing to answer people's questions. But thanks for the great comments. Thanks for Paul for being a great chair. Thanks for Dave for doing the slides. And thanks very much to Bookmarks for putting this event on. I really appreciate it. And thanks to I recognise some of the names and, that I've met before in my research. And thanks to those people for coming along. I really appreciate this event. Very, very, very pleased about it. And, if people do get the book, please do send me your comments. I'm very interested to hear what people think about it, basically.
Okay, thanks, Paul, and thanks to everybody.